Greetings, friends! Juan Ingruski here, and this is the weekly Russian-Ukrainian War update for the week of November 10th through November 16th of 2025. If you want to continue receiving these weekly Russian-Ukrainian War updates, be sure to subscribe to my channel, give this video a thumbs up, comment your thoughts, share this video around. Keeping amazing. This week, we are going to actually start in what I now will call the Huliaipole direction. And, because in this area, the Russians have made a breakthrough. And I don't just mean, oh, small little one. I mean, in terms of the scale of this war, like what's been going on for the last 3 years or so, this is a very major, we're seeing lots of rapid progress, especially for how long it's, within just a week's time. Last week, we talked about how the Russians finally captured Kupyansk. We had the Russians raising the flags here. And I'm like, okay, maybe they might take a pause. Maybe they might, it'll be a slow process towards trying to reach Huliaipole. But it seems like there was a localized collapse of Ukrainian defenses here. Because this week, they did not stop at Dnipropetrovsk. What happened was the Russians made a localized breakthrough here and have reached basically right on the outskirts of Huliaipole. And because of this, there's this massive push through these fields. And this is really good news because there's like two rivers here, and these rivers are more on the lowland. So these like fields right here that the Russians have been taken are now actually at a higher elevation. Which gives them a small overview of Huliaipole from a higher range, higher elevation. And so there was a breakthrough in this area, in the capture of Novopavlivka, of Solovki. And then, a few days later, we saw the Russians completely take Rivnopolye and Yabolovka here. I thought the Ukraine, Rivnopolye, as you can see, is kind of on that, in the middle of between these two fields, is on the higher elevation. So I thought the Ukrainians would hold on to at least Rivnopolye in a bit at a higher rate, but it seemed like there was a localized collapse in Ukrainian defenses here, and they had to fall back to Huliaipole. And so, and the Russians we had the Russians raising the flags here, so and so forth. So this entire area had a localized collapse and was captured by the Russians. In this past week, and not only that, we had in this lower section here, we had geolocated confirmation of the Russians not be right now being right here, right on the outskirts, like basically between the villages of Vasola and Zolana High, and we had another geolocated confirmation of the Russians being right on the outskirts of the village of Zaporizhia here. It's one of those villages that are like, I guess, just a bunch of like warehouses, and it's like 1 or 2 street villages here. But yeah, it's like, as you can see, it's like right next to Huliaipole, and we have the Russians right, if I remember correctly from that geolocation, like right here. I think they captured 2 or maybe killed 2 Ukrainian drone operators that were in this tree line. But this proves that while it has not been confirmed by like the Russians or Ukrainians, I think right now, because they're just probably mopping up. They just want, before they announce that they want to mop up resistance here. But I'm pretty certain that as I'm recording here, actually on the ground, that the villages of Vasola and Zolana High have probably been taken by the Russian forces as well. And Vyazovsk probably still has a Ukrainian garrison here, but I wouldn't be surprised that as the Russians collapse onto Zaporizhia and start reaching Huliaipole, that the Ukrainians have to fall back because their flank got exposed and they have to retreat to Huliaipole. So I wouldn't be surprised if Vyazovsk falls in the next week. But yeah, so yeah, a very big collapse for the Ukrainians, and I wouldn't be surprised if the Russians keep pushing down this way, probably capture more of this area. And my theory is that the Russians are just going to go straight towards Huliaipole. I mean, obviously, I always thought that they continue pushing towards this highway here, these line of villages, so that they could start attacking from the north. But they're going to do that for sure, but I think they're also going to just try to go directly into Huliaipole and start setting up shop here. One thing about this war is that it's flipped the rules of war on its head, in the sense of that Huliaipole, you won't actually fight in urban battles, because the biggest killer of infantry, about 90% of all infantry deaths, are from drones. And if you're in an urban area, you're actually able to defend yourself from drones a lot better than out in the field. So what I think the Russians want to do, the reason also why they wanted to capture Kupyansk, which is now the area they're going to accumulate forces to then do a spring attack, or not a spring attack, but like a, not in the spring, as in the weather spring, but or the season spring. I meant like as a springboard towards Huliaipole. As you can see with Huliaipole, with this Russian breakthrough towards Huliaipole, and that this battle for the city is about to start very soon, is that it's split in half by the Hnacha River here. And as you can see, there's this like area to the north of it which has no defenses because the Russians are attacking from behind, and the Ukrainians weren't expecting an attack from behind. And also, it's only a bunch of low-level residential areas. There's some like warehouses, but besides that, the more built-up high-rise building areas are in the other side of the river. And so I actually do think the Russians are going to try to basically take this section of Huliaipole, this northern section, which I think is about a quarter of the town. And this would allow them to have a springboard and then be able to cross the river, just like they did when they entered Uspenivka, when they attacked the Uspenivka defense line and managed to cross the Yanchur River and start attacking Huliaipole. Probably enter it where the river is less risen up. Probably enter it from here. Probably try to enter it from this area, and so just kind of put the squeeze on Huliaipole. But I do think the Russians are going to at least try to take this northern part of Huliaipole and just have a foothold in that town. And so, considering how big this breakthrough is, I wouldn't be surprised if by next week I talk about that the battle for Huliaipole begins, because we're going to start seeing Russian soldiers entering this area by next week. Now, maybe not. Maybe the Ukrainians are able to use Huliaipole and are able to start holding on to their defenses here, but we're not sure yet. So we have to see how much of a collapse the Ukrainians have here, if the Ukrainians are able to even send more reserves here, because they've been putting a lot of reserves in the Pokrovsk and Kupyansk sectors, so they might not have a lot more for the Huliaipole area. But yeah, that's happening there. Now, that's not the only place where the Russians are making a lot of progress. They're also making progress further north. The Russians have also completely taken the village of Dnipropetrovsk. This means that they actually have physically cut the Pokrovsk-Huliaipole highway. So Pokrovsk is another big town that the Russians are not towards yet, but is another big logistics area for the Ukrainians in the Dnipropetrovsk direction, and this was the main supply route to Huliaipole. As you can see, with the fall of Dnipropetrovsk, the Russians have completely cut it. And as you can see, it actually reaches. There's like this intersection of three rivers here, and so and also the Russians are now clearing all these fields to the south of it as well. So I wouldn't be surprised if once the Russians, once they reach this river, they could take the villages of Nachichaki, Rodasy, Nova Zaporizhia, and just clear up a bunch of these villages that are to the north of Huliaipole. And once they reach this river, this goes both ways. There's the next defense line that the Ukrainians have built up, kind of runs around this way. They have a river here, which Syriac has painted in blue here. Let me redo this in blue here this is where the Russians want to take this area here, and so then they could actually then start attacking Huliaipole, which I think is where they're going to aim for. Now, this red line I put is where the next Ukrainian defense line is. If you actually scroll down here, there's actually it's a connection of a lot of decently sized towns, like Turnovodovki. As you can see, this is a pretty decent sized town. Riza Donovka. Also, I can't even pronounce. These are names I cannot even pronounce. But anyway, these are pretty decent-sized towns. They're on the other side of this river, and the only thing between the river and them is a bunch of open fields, which is very bad for infantry. Now, considering how bad the collapse of the Ukrainian fortress is, I wouldn't be surprised if the Russians, once they start, taking like this area right here, they try to do some sort of localized breakthrough here and try to take the town of Turnovka. If they could take the village of Turnovka, this would create a breakthrough in the Ukrainian defenses here, and the Russians would have a bridgehead here. And from here, they'll be able to do a lot of damage to Ukrainian positions. But the Ukrainians, if they put their act together and the Russians slow down, they can then recreate a defense line along these towns and on the other side of this village. And then, Huliaipole might fall, but then, the Ukrainians could try to then stop the Russians around here. But it just depends on how, if this doesn't turn to a full rout for them. But yeah, anyway, that doesn't mean Huliaipole is completely cut off. As you can see, there's also the regular roads that supply Huliaipole, and so, but this was like the main highway. But now, and so the Ukrainians have to push supply deeper and deeper west just to protect it from drones, which makes the supply. It's harder to bring supply to Huliaipole, but it's not impossible. It just takes a longer time to put troops there and supplies. But yeah, cutting this highway is a pretty decent deal for the Russians after they take Dnipropetrovsk here. But we shall see if the Russians could break through this next defense line for the Ukrainians around this area that I mentioned. A bit more further to the north here, the Russians have also completely captured the village of Erostepopol. I always thought they would do this, and Erostepopol was like kind of where the Ukrainians were using as a bridgehead to these attacks towards Sontsevka, towards Novoselivka that the Ukrainians were always mentioning. And with the fall of Erostepopol, this is not only a very pretty big, pretty decent sized village. This village allows the Russians to accumulate forces here and then start attacking Velika Milikaivka, which I think will happen soon. Now it's on the other side of the Volga River, and so the Ukrainians can, if they want to, if they put troops here to have Velika Milikaivka as a defense hub and repel any Russian advance. But I do think the Russians will try to try to take Velika Milikaivka, to create another bridgehead in this direction, just like they did in Ivanovka a bit more further north, which we mentioned before. And if the Russians could take, something like this, take these forests and Velika Milikaivka, the next thing I think the Russians will do, is probably then start storming. A lot of people saying Pokrovsk is kind of a main goal for the Russians. I do think in the future that's going to be the thing, but I think the Russians, before they start attacking Pokrovsk, they want to, encircle it on, they want to put some pressure on it. They don't want to just go do a Leroy Jenkins moment and just attack it directly. I might see them try to take the village of Alexandrivka, just like they took Erostepopol, because it's on the other side of the river, and this gives them a bridgehead to attack Pokrovsk. But I don't think they're gonna. I think they want to maybe take the towns of Garlovka and Pigarlovka here. Create a bridge here along with Novopavlivka, which is on the other side of the river here. And then from here, as you can see, this gives the Russians a solid bridgehead with very big towns where they could accumulate forces. Velika Milikaivka, Garlovka, Ivanovka, Novopavlivka, very decent-sized towns. Now, the Ukrainians will have the height advantage here because this is on the rivers here, and Prozny is on a localized height advantage, and it's one of the most built-up towns in this area. As you can see, it has a Terracon, has an industrial zone, high-rise buildings. So Prozny is the grand prize in this direction. However, but in order to actually push towards Prozny, if they want to do that, or even towards Pokrovsk, they need to have a bridgehead on the other side of this river, which is what Pokrovsk is on. And so once the Russians have a bridgehead in here, they could then, obviously push towards the river that's here, take all these villages to the south of Pokrovsk, but then also move to the north here, take a bunch of these villages, and then start attacking Pokrovsk from the east as well as from the south, and then, start trying to take Pokrovsk as well. And so kind of the main goal for the Russians, I think, is to take something like this, take Pokrovsk, and take this area, and then the Ukrainians will fall back to the Mazova-Prozny line, and that will be for once they take those towns. I think that the Russians will then advance towards these two towns here for the Dnipropetrovsk Oblast. But in any case, taking Erostepopol is a very good first gain for the Russians. And then we're gonna now talk about I'm going to talk about Novopavlivka. That's another big thing, but I kind of combined that with the Pokrovsk direction. But before we go to the Pokrovsk direction and talk about Novopavlivka and such, let me talk about the Zaporizhia direction very quickly. There's not been that much changes. There have been some unconfirmed changes from the Russian side, saying that they've captured most of Stepanhursk, that they've captured this western side and this eastern residential area, and the only place left for the Ukrainians is the central. This central part with high-rise buildings, but we don't have any geolocated confirmation of that, so we just need to wait for more confirmation of that. And then also they announced that they captured Malotakmashka. Now we talked about almost a month ago, I think, about the Russians doing a giant counterattack that led them into the center of Malotakmashka, but then we didn't hear any more about that after that attack. So I thought they got repelled and got destroyed. The biggest thing for the Malotakmashka is this prison colony right here. If the Russians don't hold this prison colony, then there's no actual base of operations they could take for the rest of Malotakmashka. But if they take this prison colony, then they have a foothold in Malotakmashka, and this could allow them to take the rest of this area, because the rest of it is just residential areas. But basically, the main jewel is this prison colony right here. So, but if the Russians have taken that, then they could probably have taken Malotakmashka. But if they have not taken it, then I think their claims of taking Malotakmashka are bogus. But we shall have to wait because we don't have any proof of that yet. Alrighty, now we're gonna go to the Pokrovsk direction, and let's talk about Pokrovsk. Okay. Before we talk about, I combined this. I kind of discussed that the Pokrovsk direction is kind of like something like this. This area is all about Pokrovsk, and so let's talk about Novopavlivka. Let's just talk about it before we talk about Pokrovsk itself. Novopavlivka is Yeah, because now another thing about that's this war is flipped on its head is that you actually want to attack in very shitty weather conditions. And what I mean by that is that before you want to attack on open ground, sunny days, you want your tanks rolling forward. The thing is that because of drones, that's a very bad idea. There's been since it's like the fall time in Ukraine, and it's very rainy and foggy and such. This creates a lot of good conditions for that. When it's foggy, the drones can't fly, and that means that you actually could do counterattack. You actually could do attacks with mechanized assaults, and that's what the Russians did. The Russians did a mechanized assault, which led them into capturing the entire eastern part of Novopavlivka. We didn't have geolocated confirmation of this. We had said like, hey, maybe the Russians are in the most southern part, but then they did a localized attack, which led them. We had geolocation of the Russians being right in the most northern part here. So it wasn't just like, oh, we see them here. We actually saw them in this northern part here. And so most mappers, and because of that proof, has said that this entire eastern part of Novopavlivka has fallen. Now, the thing is that Novopavlivka is split in half by the Solona River here. So there's this western part, this like northern part of Novopavlivka that is still under Ukrainian control. But a lot of pro-Russian sources are saying that the Russians have even crossed this river, have certain positions on the other side, and now it's just a matter of clearing up the rest of the northern part. Another thing is that the Russians are in Ivanovka. So what the Russians could do is try to keep clearing these like tree lines and such to the edge of Novopavlivka, and then be able to attack it from here, because the Russians could use Ivanovka as a supply hub as they then send troops towards this part here. So then, the Russians could attack it on multiple angles. And then, as I mentioned earlier about the Russians the Russians will create a bridgehead with Novopavlivka and Ivanovka, because once they have, these are two very decent sized towns, and the Russians could use that as defenses. And then, from here, there's nothing here. The Ukrainians have, the next Ukrainian defense line is in Mazova towards Prosny, so it's on the high ground. So they could defend this place, once Novopavlivka falls. But if they want to recapture Novopavlivka and Ivanovka, they'll have to cross a bunch of open space, and the Russians could destroy them with drones. So once Novopavlivka falls, the Ukrainians will have to fall back to Mazova and such. But yeah, the capture of the eastern part of Novopavlivka is a very big tragedy for the Ukrainians, and a very big gain for the Russians. So I do expect Novopavlivka to probably fall very soon. All right, now let's actually talk about Pokrovsk itself. And technically Novopavlivka, the purpose of the offensive operation here is to secure the western flank of the Russian grouping in Pokrovsk. So that's why I kind of talked about it when I talked about Pokrovsk. And Pokrovsk, there's been, we talked about the fall of Pokrovsk last week. This week, basically, the main show is the Russians continuing to trying to squeeze out the Leningrad pocket, and the Ukrainians still doing attacks trying to de-blockade Leningrad. So kind of the main, this is like mostly about a Leningrad story, because Pokrovsk has been completely taken, and there's been no, the Ukrainians have not been trying to re-enter Pokrovsk, basically. And again, the Russians are still clearing it. It's going to take a long time. It's going to take a while for them to clear everything, to secure it, as I mentioned last week. But Pokrovsk has fallen. Now, so the main clashes have been in Leningrad. One of the biggest changes is in the southern part. The Russians have completely cleared, either by completely destroying them, or they somehow retreated. But I think they just got completely destroyed because the Ukrainians just left them for dead. But this southern salient of the salient here in Listovka and Suka Yar have completely fallen. We have the Russians raising their flags in these areas. So, this like kind of southern salient of this pocket has been destroyed, and the Ukrainians had to fall back. Along with this southern Leningrad area is completely collapsing. It's not been completely captured by the Russians like the southern part here, like Suka Yar and Listovka have been. But we are seeing more and more evidence that the southern Leningrad pocket, everything to the south of this kind of this like a few high-rise building areas are getting captured. We actually had geolocated confirmation of the Ukrainians bombing Russian positions in some of these high-rise building areas. So I wouldn't be surprised if the Russians could take this. This would spell doom for this entire southern part of Leningrad. So, just as the Russian, we had the Russians raising their flags in the village of Ri. We had geolocated confirmation of the Russians being all over these kind of farms to the east of Pokrovsk. So I have no doubts that what the Russians are going to probably try to do is link up the Pokrovsk and Leningrad areas and can squeeze out the rest of the Ukrainians from the southern Leningrad area. So we have the Russians, pushing in this area right here. We have the Russians here. We have the Russians raising their flags in this industrial mining sector in the center of Leningrad. So So the Ukrainians are still Ukrainian forces fighting for the southern part of Leningrad, but I think they're trying to retreat back to the central part of Leningrad because again, there's like barely any way to supply. There's basically a pocket here, and it's almost it's impossible to bring supplies here. They could drop drone supplies, but there's the Russians are just slowly but surely squeezing this Leningrad hot pocket, and it's hard enough just to supply the main defense in the center of Leningrad. It's even harder to even supply the southern part. So that's probably why the Ukrainians were defeated in this area. And I wouldn't be surprised by the end of next week that the Russians completely take everything under this red line and the Ukrainians fall back to a 360 defense around Leningrad. The thing is that Leningrad itself is being infiltrated. We had a lot of sources are saying that this like residential area in the north. East of Leningrad has been taken, that the Russians are entering this northern citadel of Leningrad. The Russians are obviously pushing in the village of Rivnia. Some sources saying the village of Rivnia has been captured, but we don't have confirmation of that yet. We just had confirmation of the Russians being around Rivnia, but it has not been captured yet. But I do think the village of Rivnia probably has been captured, but they just need to clear it. So the Ukrainians are now falling back to the central citadel. The citadel right here. Apparently, the citadel, we had geolocated confirmation of the Russians attacking it, but then getting destroyed when they entered it. But it is interesting to show that this mapper says that this eastern citadel of high-rise buildings from Leningrad has been taken by the Russians. So it's very interesting that this is a gray zone, and that if because this eastern part falls, then that basically spells doom for Leningrad, because then the Russians could accumulate a lot of forces here and then break. They're attacking from the north, they're breaking through from the west, they're attacking from the south. So this entire Leningrad hot pocket is being squeezed like a stress ball and it's about to pop. So the Russians are breaking in, are in Leningrad. They have and everything, so it's about to burst at the seams. So very bad news for Leningrad, but I don't know why else they're trying to hold on for so long. I think maybe for PR purposes, but we shall see how that develops. Also, the Russians are pushing towards Grishny. They have not entered it just yet, but a lot of mappers are saying that more and more of these fields these fields like right from between Pokrovsk and Grishny are being taken. The Russians are now advancing along this rail line, using this as a natural defense and, clearing more and more of this area. A lot of mappers are saying that this Pokrovsky mine is being fought over and is about to be taken as well, which will be a very good area for the Russians to accumulate forces and supply. And so if the Russians could, take this Pokrovsky mine and, secure themselves something like, like this, take, everything like this, then they could start storming Grishny, attack it, from, try to enter it in this area, try to enter it and, just have a foothold in Grishny and just continuously push the Ukrainians further and further out, and such from Grishny. But the thing is, Grishny has very good supply. It still has its main supply route through here. It can be supplied, so its main supply route could be, so it's not, the Ukrainians aren't cut off from supply in Grishny. So it's going to be very, unless the Ukrainians have a very weak unit here, or the unit here has been, and that might make sense. The Ukrainians who were holding Pokrovsk and got overrun fell back to Grishny, and unless the Ukrainians have a new unit here or a more fresh unit, they might not be able to hold Grishny for as long as they might. But if it's a fresh new unit that just got reconstituted, they could probably hold on to Grishny a lot longer than than usual. But we shall see. But yeah, at least having a foothold in Grishny will make any sort of counterattacks from Grishny a lot harder towards Pokrovsk, if the Ukrainians want to do that, which seems like they don't want to. And then towards Dnipropetrovsk, the Russians and Ukrainians are doing back and forths here. The battle for Rudinsky is back on. The Ukrainians re-entered Rudinsky and were trying to push the Russians completely out of Rudinsky. The thing is, the Russians have counterattacked and have re-entered at least the southern part. So when we talk about Rudinsky, which is the main stronghold, that if the Russians lose Rudinsky, this gives the Ukrainians a very solid gain to be able to actually deblock in Leningrad. That's why the Russians are putting a lot of forces back into Rudinsky. Kind of the way most mappers are saying is that this kind of central part right here is under Ukrainian control along with this mine. And then this southern part, let's put this in blue, why not, is under Russian control. And then this kind of residential area in the north is just nobody owns it because nobody really wants to control it. But most mappers are saying that it's mostly under Russian control. So, but yeah, Rudinsky is back on being fought over, so it's not completely secured. It's not they didn't take Rudinsky, But I mean, they did take Radinsky, but then the Ukrainians counterattacked, re-entered it, but then and then almost pushed the Russians out, but the Russians counterattacked. So there's a lot of back and forth happening in Radinsky. So, but yeah, so right now the Ukrainians earlier this week were actually almost about to push the Russians out of here, but then the Russians counterattacked, are now back in control of Radinsky. So we shall see if the Russians could kick the Ukrainians out of Radinsky, or if the Ukrainians double down and manage to kick the Russians out again. So we shall see how that develops. And then a bit more here, we had actually geolocated confirmation of the Ukrainians being in Zaporizhia. So this actually does prove that this area is not just a gray zone, but it is more or less where the Ukrainians are operating. We had geolocated confirmation of the Ukrainians getting bombed in the southern part of Zaporizhia. But then later this week, we had geolocated confirmation, I think somewhere around the most eastern part of Zaporizhia, the Russians having bombed. So this shows that Zaporizhia is kind of the center of kind of the back and forth, and the Ukraine, again, the Sudetsky and Zaporizhia are just two small villages. It's very hard to accumulate forces here in the middle of these fields. So the Russians could bomb this with impunity. So it's gonna, and the Russians have this industrial mining sector of Radinsky, which gives them a strong, not just a local height advantage, but just a industrial zone they could hold on to. So what I think the Ukrainians want to do is push the Russians out from Fedorovka and Pokrovsk, this area right here, so that because there's a bunch of trenches here, and it's on the other side of the Kerensky-Terez River. Because then, if they push the Russians behind this river, they could then cut off Russian forces that are being supplied in Radinsky, this Radinsky mine, and so forth. So the battle for Zaporizhia is actually very, very important, because if the Ukrainians can't push the Russians out of Radinsky, they're going to hope to try to yeah, there we go. Is to try to cut off the supply by breaking through by pushing the Russians out of the Kerensky-Terez River. A bit more to the north here, we had more. Is that the battle for Shakova is actually, I thought the Russians would retreat from Shakova, but actually we had geolocated confirmation of the Russians actually almost taking Shakova. We had geolocated confirmation of the Russians taking the area of Shakova on the other side of this river right here. What is this river even called? The Kerensky-Terez River. Wow. Okay. Well, I guess that makes sense actually. But anyway, so the part of Shakov on the eastern side has been taken by the Russians, and also this western part. Now only the center part remains, and a lot of sources are saying the Ukrainians were kicked out of here, but we haven't had the Russians raising their flags here. So, but if the Russians could take Shakova, this would give the Russians a very strong position to defend their flank, and then the Russians could then just defend between Shakova and Dorodezhny. So this is where the Russians are still in Nikolaevka. This area, right, as you can see, this is still a bit of a gray zone here, but this kind of Dnipropetrovsk salient that kind of extended towards Zolo, Kolodasky, Kuchevyar has been cut off by the Ukrainians, but the Russians, this saves Dnipropetrovsk, but as long as the Russians could hold on, at least between Shakova and Dorodezhny around this area, then they could protect their northern flank of that's encircling Pokrovsk. So for the Russians, right now the Ukrainians could celebrate that they saved Dnipropetrovsk, but if the Ukrainians want to deblockade Minograd, they have to kick the Russians out all the way to take everything behind the Kerensky-Terez River, and everything that's behind here, on the other side of this area needs to be taken. They need to take back Radinsky. They need to take back, Panivka, Mayak, Boltovka, basically this entire trench system that's all here. So these Terracons right here. So there's a lot of things the Ukrainians have to do to deblockade Minograd, but all the Russians have to do basically now is that just hold on to the Shakova-Dorodezhny line, hold on to Radinsky, and then probably if they can, take back, try to push the Ukrainians out of Zaporizhia and Sudetsky, and have the front line be something like this. If they could hold something like this, then they'll be in a better position. But I think right now the biggest threat is this area in Zaporizhia. But if the Russians could then hold on to this, and the Ukrainians are just out in these fields near Belitsky, then that'd be good for them as well. But yeah, that's the Pokrovsk direction. Now we're going to go to the Kostyantynivka direction, and this is where we talked about the battle for Kostyantynivka starting in the fall, and this week the Russians are continuously putting their pressure on here. The biggest news that came from Kostyantynivka this week is that the Russians are actually putting the squeeze on Ivanopolia, and I wouldn't be surprised if the town of Ivanopolia falls soon. We had geolocated confirmation of the Russians being in this kind of area right here. It kind of helps because there's a river and a train track, I think, that kind of runs on the other side of the like as you guys can see with this red line. So the Russians, the Russians are moving here. They have position. They cut off this highway that the Ukrainians used to supply Ivano-Pilia from Kostyantynivka. And then, if that highway gets cut, then they have to go through these fields to supply Ivano-Pilia, and as you can see, that allows them to get cut off by drones. So, with the Russians, now breaking into Ivano-Pilia from the north, the Russians already being in Ivano-Pilia from the south here, capturing these warehouses, I wouldn't be surprised that the central part of Ivano-Pilia falls very soon. So, yeah, that's the biggest gain, and the reason for this is that once the Russians take Ivano-Pilia and take something like this, then they have a string of villages where the Russians could then accumulate forces, and then instead of just being on this open fields here, where it's going to be very hard to supply the Russian garrison that's in this area in Kostyantynivka. Now the thing is that maybe the garrison, these are just DRGs that are in Kostyantynivka, there's no consolidation, and maybe those DRGs got eliminated, and there's no more Russian garrison here. But we had multiple geolocated confirmation of the Russians being here, so so they might not have complete control of everything in that thing I circled, but we had a lot of geolocated confirmation all around this kind of residential area here. So maybe the Russians are still there, maybe they consolidated, but the supply situation here is very precarious for the Russians, because if we look a bit more to the north here, this area near Stubichki and Protishnia, we actually had a Ukrainian counterattack happening, and because the Russians did not push, which I thought they would do, from Chasiv Yar across this rail line, try to take more and more of these villages to the north of Kostyantynivka, because they did not do that, the Ukrainians were able to counterattack the Russians in this area, and they got their tanks got blown up, but they're able to enter Stubichki and Protishnia very easily and disrupt Russian supplies towards Kostyantynivka from Chasiv Yar and Bakhmut. Anyway, the battle, so right now the main purpose for the Russians is to make their positions in Kostyantynivka a lot better, and that's why they're right now breaking into Ivano-Pilia, which is very good for them. But but we shall see how that develops. The Russians actually are making some progress a bit more to the north of Chasiv Yar, a little bit more north than I thought they would move towards, but we had geolocated confirmation of the Russians being in these tree lines to the south of Mayatsky here. We didn't have any Russians raising their flags here, but maybe they'll raise their flag soon on Mayatsky. Some sources are, we talked about how the Russians claim they have taken Nova Markova or Markova. We had no proof of that, but we did have confirmation of the Russians being along this the canal here, so it does prove that this canal is under Russian control. So I do think that the Russians do have a very good position if they want to take Nova Markova, Fedorivka, Mayatsky, have their northern flank secure here. And then, maybe what they want to do next, once they do that, is, kind of push along this rail line, take the village of Verolubovka, Popasna, Stinky, Chernobyl here. And then, if they could take something like this, then they could have, the northern flank secured for their assault on Kostyantynivka. So I do think that's something they should push towards. I think that would be a good gain for the Russians. But I think after they took Chasiv Yar, they took a lot of casualties, and they've been trying to reconstitute since then. So, but right now pushing towards here, is I think something they need to do to prevent the Ukrainians from doing counterattacks to destroy their supply situation to attack Kostyantynivka. Alrighty, now we're going to go to the Seversk direction. The Seversk and Lyman directions have been kind of more slow lately since November began. There's not been that much changes in both those directions. The biggest thing is that we had more and more geolocated confirmation of the Russians being in Dronovka. We had the Russians being in this tree line near the south of Dronovka. We had the we had the Russians raising their flags here. So it does show that Dronovka is under full Russian control. Also, along with this, we had geolocation of the Russians attacking this giant trench fortification system that's right in front of Seversk. So they're just doing a direct assault. That's probably going to leave a mark here, but right now there's battles going on right here. In these tree lines, in these trench systems. If you zoom down, you could see that happening. I think at least you should. You oughta. yeah, you could start seeing this. But anyway, there's actually a very fortified trench system that's in front of Seversk that the Russians are fighting for, and we also have the Russians being the south of Seversk here. We have the Russians now trying to put the squeeze on Swanovka here, and just to have a position on the southern part of Seversk. So I think right now they're trying to clear out Swanovka, and then once they take Swanovka, they could then start entering Seversk. But we shall see how that develops. But yeah. But yeah, besides that, there's not been that much more changes here. Just the Russians continue putting the squeeze on Seversk. Same thing in Lyman. There's actually not been that much changes in Lyman. We still don't know the status of Yampil. Like, the battle for Yampil is still ongoing, but we don't know what's going on here. The battle for Stavka is still ongoing, but we don't know if that's been resolved. We know that Dobrozheva is mostly under Ukrainian control. We actually had GLK confirmation of the Ukrainians attacking Russian positions here with actually a tank. So we don't know if the Ukrainians expelled the Russians from the northern part of Dobrozheva, but we do know Russians were at least in this area. So we don't know what's the status there. We had GLK confirmation of the Russians crossing a river and taking up positions around the eastern part of Novopavlivka. So it does show that there's at least some part of Novopavlivka that's under Russian control, but we don't know if that was the Russians just regrouping, sending troops there, or if they were actually trying to take positions, and that Novopavlivka is still in a bit of a gray zone. So we don't, and a lot of sources, even though are showing that the Russians are driving right towards the village of Kucher Yar and Alexandrivka, and taking a bunch of these fields here, but I think these are just DRG activities. I don't know if there's any consolidation happening there. So there's a lot of open questions of what's happening in the Lyman direction. So, and there's been no really changes on the map, and not just in this map, but any map in Lyman. So, there was a lot of changes happening here rapidly in like September and even October, but then it's been kind of slowing down. But we shall see how maybe there'll be new changes next week. Alrighty, next we're going to go to the Kupyansk direction and / Kharkov direction. And this week, the Ukrainians, there's not been that much changes on the map, but there's been a lot of, if you follow war telegram channels, they're saying that there's a lot of fierce back and forths happening at Kupyansk. That the Ukrainians are doing counterattacks. The Ukrainians are trying to trying to attack the Russians from the south here, from Swadova. They're trying to attack and try to cut off Russian positions near Radovka. And the Russians are holding on to Kupyansk very tightly here. But the battle for Kupyansk is still ongoing. The Ukrainians do not want to lose it. It's a big town that they don't want to lose. Same thing with Pokrovsk. So even though the situation here is very hopeless for the Ukrainians, they're still going to hold on to it as much as they can so they could deny that Kupyansk has been taken. The main thing is that the eastern part is being cleared, and basically the only part left is this southeastern part of Kupyansk. I don't think we had we had GLK confirmation of the Russians being here, but we had no geolocations of the Russians clearing this area in the north here. But if the Russians are in the south here, then that probably does mean that this northern part has been taken. But so it's very fluid. Again, it's kind of like Pokrovsk in the sense that Kupyansk is very fluid. There's probably, we had GLK confirmation of the Russians being bombed in the most southern part of Kupyansk, so at least they're there. There's probably still pockets of Ukrainian resistance in Kupyansk, and there's probably still a lot of back and forth happening here. But there's a lot of fierce clashes here, and we shall see how that develops. But we still don't actually know quite exactly what's going on, like where exactly Russian positions are, where Ukraine positions are this week. We just know Russians are basically in almost all of Kupyansk except the most southeastern part here. But it's going to take, the Russians might be able to take Kupyansk, but it's going to, again, like Pokrovsk, it's going to take a while for them to secure it because they need to actually not only take it, but then expand outwards to push the Ukrainians out of there. A bit more in the Kharkov direction in general, near Volchansk. The Russians are, for some reason, this map does not want to load. It looks like it. Wow. Okay, well, my map is acting like a complete retard right now. I don't know why, but... Alrighty, I am back. Sorry about that. I had to reload my internet because it shat its pants. Maybe there was too much gains happening in like this Kharkov area, but not really. It kind of shut off on, anyway, on the very last second for some reason. Anyway, we're back though. Anyway, the biggest change is that the Russians are slowly but surely putting the squeeze around Dobrozhiransky here. I have no doubts the Russians will take this village and then, have their positions here. As I mentioned last video, the main Ukrainian defenses are along this river on this set of villages here. So this is where the Ukrainian defense is here. So I don't think the Ukrainians will put up any fight for this village here, and the Russians will, take this set of this last village here and have you know this kind of these border villages taken in Kharkov, and then in Volchansk itself, we had the Russians taking the village of Shelilokovo here. So we have, it's a very good, as I mentioned, this is I talked about how the Russians will move down along the Seversk Donetsk River, start pushing towards Stary Saltov and such like that. So I do think that's going to be the next area for the Russians to push towards. And then in Volchansk, the Russians are still pushing towards the southwestern part of Volchansk. The only part left that's under Ukrainian control is residential area because they took the last citadel. So they're just going to take a week or two or a little bit to clear out this residential area, and then from here they'll be able to they'll probably also continue pushing this towards Volchansky Khodorkovka here, and then once they have like this, the Ukrainians could fall back to Huliaipole, but this area will probably be cut off as the Russians push towards Semenivka, Harovska here from along the river. So Huliaipole will probably fall pretty, because there's no actual fortified area in Huliaipole. It's just a bunch of residential areas, so it'll probably be taken pretty easily. That being said, the next big Ukrainian defense will be in Belya-Kolodosky, and since the difference between Volchansk and Belya-Kolodosky is a bunch of open fields, I don't think the Russians will advance towards here because it's just, the Ukrainians will be able to drone them pretty easily, but we shall see how that happens. But yeah, once Volchansk falls and everything like that, and the Russians have a very secure buffer zone, maybe even down here, have something like this going on. Maybe they might stop. Maybe they're like, okay, that's all we wanted to do. We wanted to create a buffer zone in Kharkov. But if the Russians want to continue moving, the next defense for the Ukrainians will be in Belya-Kolodosky here. So we shall see how that develops. But anyway, yeah, Volchansk is about to fall. And yeah, that's the end of this video. Hope you guys enjoyed this weekly Russian-Ukrainian War update. Be sure to subscribe to my channel to continue receiving this weekly Russian-Ukrainian War update. Like this video, comment your thoughts, share this video around. I'm doing more interviews with more and more people, and so I hope you guys enjoyed that as well. So that's something you can look forward to. Yeah, so I hope you guys aim high and wander on.